On a stormy night, a frightened boy clutches a silver watch, pleading for help from a man who thought he'd left childhood pain behind. Alexander Grant, a wealthy businessman accustomed to ignoring the suffering around him, finds himself face to face with a choice that will change both their lives forever. What starts as a chance encounter plunges him into a dark web of family secrets, deceit, and a fight for justice. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. The rain had a way of swallowing sound, of turning the city into a blur of glistening lights and shadow. On that particular night, Alexander Grant felt more than the chill in his bones. He felt something gnawing at the edges of his carefully constructed life. The kind of feeling a man tries to ignore when he has spent decades convincing himself he owes the world nothing. He had everything money could buy, but not the kind of warmth that fills an empty house at midnight. He had power, influence, and the kind of reputation that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. But none of that mattered in the moment when he heard a whisper rising from the rain. At first, he thought it was nothing more than his mind playing tricks. A fragment of sound carried on the storm. Yet the words were clear enough to cut through the downpour. "Please take me home, sir." They were fragile, uncertain, almost as if the boy himself did not believe they would be heard. Alexander could have ignored it. A younger version of him might have even turned his collar up and walked faster, unwilling to let another person's need pierce the armor he had built over the years. But something in the tone, the tremor of desperation, rooted him to the pavement. He turned, scanning the street, and then he saw him. A boy no older than 10, hunched beneath the sickly glow of a streetlight. His shoulders were trembling, his thin jacket clinging to his small frame as the rain poured down. His fists were clenched tight, but one hand gripped something that shimmered faintly in the light, a silver watch. Not the kind of trinket a child usually carried, but one that seemed to hold his entire weight of existence. The boy's face was pale, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes carried that hollow look Alexander had seen once before in the mirror of his youth, when he was little more than another abandoned soul hoping someone might care. Alexander felt his chest tighten. He was not a man who often looked backward, but the sight of the boy cracked something open. Memories he had buried beneath years of boardrooms and contracts rushed to the surface. Nights when he himself had gone hungry. Days when no one came to pick him up. A voice inside whispered that this boy was not his problem, not his responsibility, and that he would be wiser to keep walking. Yet his feet betrayed him. They carried him forward, step by step, until he was standing before the boy. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, though his voice carried more sharpness than comfort. The boy shrank at the tone, but he did not run. Instead, he held out the watch as though it were proof of something. Proof of belonging, or maybe of survival. His lips trembled, and then he repeated the words Alexander had first heard. "Please take me home, sir." The rain seemed to fall harder then, hammering against the pavement, drowning out the rest of the world. Alexander reached out almost without thinking, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. It was colder than he expected, and beneath it he could feel the sharpness of bone. Whoever this child was, he had not been cared for in some time. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For years, Alexander had prided himself on staying detached, on never allowing sentiment to sway him. Yet there, in that rain-soaked street, sentiment came rushing back with the force of a tide. He could have asked questions. He could have demanded explanations. But instead, he did the one thing he had not done in decades. He opened his car door and guided someone inside. Without a contract, without an agenda, without expecting anything in return. The boy slid into the seat, dripping water onto the leather, clutching the watch to his chest as though it were a lifeline. Alexander shut the door, circled the car, and slid behind the wheel, his own clothes soaked through. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. As the engine hummed and the wipers struggled against the torrent, Alexander found himself glancing at the boy from the corner of his eye. The child's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the watch, and Alexander realized he was not merely clutching it, but stroking it gently, almost reverently. He wanted to ask whose it was, what it meant, but something stopped him. He sensed that the boy would speak when he was ready, and forcing it would only make him close off further. Instead, Alexander said softly, "You're safe now." The words felt foreign on his tongue, as though he were reciting a language he had forgotten. The boy's eyes flicked toward him for the first time, measuring, weighing, searching for sincerity. Then slowly he nodded. Alexander told himself he was only offering the boy a ride, nothing more. He would drop him at a police station or a shelter, let someone else handle the responsibility. Yet as the miles passed beneath the tires, he could not shake the feeling that his life had just been altered in ways he did not yet understand. Because that boy's whisper had not only pierced the storm, it had pierced him. And as he drove through the rain, Alexander realized something that unsettled him more than any business deal or hostile takeover ever had. He thought he was rescuing the boy, but the truth pressed against his heart with each passing moment. It was the boy who was rescuing him. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the faint stirrings of something he thought long dead: compassion, memory, a reminder that even the richest man can be the poorest soul, and that sometimes salvation comes not in grand gestures, but in the quiet plea of a child who has nothing left but hope. And as the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windshield, Alexander knew this night was not the end of a story, it was the beginning. A beginning he had almost walked away from. Almost. Alexander Grant was not born into wealth, though. One would never guess it from the way he carried himself as an adult. The sharp suits, the quiet command in his voice, the way entire rooms seemed to recalibrate around his presence, all of that was learned, built, constructed brick by brick, like the walls of a fortress. But fortresses are not built out of comfort. They are born from the memory of vulnerability, from the fear that someone might strike again. Alexander's earliest memories were not of warmth or safety, but of absence. His father had a way of promising things with a smile that made you believe every word. He would crouch down, ruffle Alexander's hair, and whisper, "Next week, son. I'll be back next week with something special." Sometimes it was a toy he promised. Sometimes a trip to the seaside. But most often it was simply the promise of being there sitting at the dinner table, reading a story before bed, taking Alexander's small hand into his own. But those promises rarely materialized. His father was a man of schemes, always chasing after some new venture that would supposedly change their lives. To the young Alexander, he was a figure larger than life, full of dreams and charisma. To his mother, he was a man slipping further and further into the shadows of his own failures. The house grew emptier as weeks stretched into months, and eventually, the door that had swung open to herald his father's return remained still and silent. Alexander learned young that waiting was its own form of cruelty. Children measure time differently. Each day feels heavier when you're counting on someone to appear. And for him, the passage of time was marked not by birthdays or school milestones, but by the sound of his mother's sighs at night and the hollow silence where his father's voice should have been. There was one object, though, that tied Alexander to his father: a watch. Not a grand one, not the kind of heirloom that speaks of generational wealth. It was a cheap silver piece, already scratched and dented, but to a boy who longed for permanence, it was everything. His father had left it behind one evening, promising he would return for it, promising it was just temporary. Alexander carried it like a talisman, believing that as long as he held on to it, his father's promise would remain intact. The watch ticked unevenly, its second hand sometimes stuttering, sometimes racing, as if it too could not decide whether to keep time or betray it. But Alexander clutched it tightly, slipping it beneath his pillow at night, pressing it against his chest during the long afternoons when other children played with fathers who had not disappeared. The watch became both his comfort and his curse. Each tick reminded him of what had been promised, and each silence between ticks reminded him of what had been lost. Children adapt, though, and Alexander adapted faster than most. He learned that tears did little to change reality, that no one was coming through the door just because he wanted it badly enough. His mother became his anchor. She was not a woman of grand speeches, nor did she indulge in self-pity. She worked tirelessly, hands raw from cleaning, voice hoarse from double shifts. But her eyes carried a quiet resilience that refused to break. One night, when Alexander had buried his face in his pillow to hide the tears, she sat at his bedside. She did not tell him that everything would be fine, for she was too honest to make promises she could not keep. Instead, she brushed his hair back with calloused fingers and said, "You cannot control who walks away, Alexander, but you can choose who you become because of it. Never let another child feel invisible. Never ignore a cry for help, no matter how small." Those words stayed with him long after the broken watch stopped ticking. At the time, they felt like little more than a mother's attempt to ease her son's grief, but they became the foundation of something deeper. Though he would later bury them beneath layers of cynicism and wealth, though he would convince himself he had no use for sentiment, those words waited, dormant, for the moment when life would test him again. As Alexander grew older, the absence of his father became less of a sharp wound and more of a dull scar. Yet scars shape the way a man moves, the way he sees the world. For Alexander, it instilled a hunger, an insatiable drive to prove that he could never again be abandoned, never again be left powerless. He poured himself into his studies, not because he loved books, but because they were weapons. Knowledge became the one thing no one could take from him, and excellence was his armor against the whispers of pity that clung to boys from broken homes. By his late teens, Alexander had already learned to calculate risk like a seasoned gambler. He worked odd jobs, saved ruthlessly, and studied markets when his peers were chasing fleeting pleasures. He wore ambition like a second skin, but beneath it all, the boy with the broken watch remained hungry, restless, and still listening for footsteps that would never return. The watch itself eventually cracked beyond repair. One careless fall from his knitstand and the glass face shattered, scattering tiny shards across the floor. Alexander gathered the pieces in trembling hands, as though he could put them back together. But no amount of effort could restore its steady tick. He sat with it for hours, unwilling to let go, until finally his mother found him. She did not tell him to throw it away. She only said, "Sometimes things break to remind us they were never meant to last." Alexander kept the remnants in a small box at the back of his drawer, but in time, even that disappeared during one of the many moves they endured. Still, the weight of it lingered. He carried the memory of its cool metal against his palm, the way it had once convinced him his father might still come back. And though he would never admit it, part of him continued to feel the absence of its weight. It was not just the loss of the watch, but what it represented, the betrayal of time itself. The hours spent waiting for someone who never came. The years lost to hoping for stability that never arrived. Those memories shaped Alexander into the man he would become, precise, disciplined, unwilling to let anything slip through his grasp. Again, by the time he built his first fortune, the boy with the broken watch had long been buried beneath contracts, mergers, and boardroom victories. He had transformed himself into the kind of man others feared to cross, the kind of man who never waited for anyone, because waiting was a weakness he could not afford. Yet on that rain-soaked night, decades later, when he saw Ben standing beneath the streetlight, clutching a silver watch so much like his own, the past surged back with brutal force. It was as though time had looped, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt like the boy he once was abandoned, waiting, desperate for someone to listen. Alexander's childhood unfolded in a world that demanded endurance. Poverty was not a passing misfortune for him. It was the air he breathed, the walls around him, the threadbare blankets that failed to keep out the winter chill. His mother stretched what little they had with ingenuity that bordered on heroism, turning stale bread into meals, sewing torn clothes so well that Alexander could almost forget they were hand-me-downs. But children notice things. They notice when the other boys at school bring shiny new satchels while yours is frayed at the corners. They notice when their fathers cheer from the sidelines at football matches while yours is a blank space, a silence that follows you even into dreams. The absence of his father was not a single wound, but 1,000 small cuts. Each birthday that passed without him was another reminder, each unanswered letter another sting. Alexander wrote to him once, a clumsy note scrawled in the uneven handwriting of a child. "When are you coming back? I still have your watch." He never received a reply. His mother never spoke ill of the man. Her silence was dignified, almost protective, but her eyes betrayed a quiet resignation that Alexander came to recognize as a form of grief. It was in those years that Alexander first began to harden. He noticed the way pity lingered in the eyes of teachers, the way neighbors spoke in hushed tones about that poor Grant boy. He hated pity more than hunger, more than the cold. Pity made him feel small, helpless, defined by circumstances he had not chosen. So he fought against it with the only weapon he possessed, his will. He became the child who never asked for help, who never cried in public, who never gave anyone the satisfaction of seeing him weak. Yet even as he built his defenses, he clung to the broken watch as if it were proof that he mattered. When he pressed it into his palm, he imagined that his father might one day come back and say, "You kept it safe. You kept faith with me. And I've kept faith with you." The fantasy never materialized, but the watch tethered him to hope, however fragile. There were moments when his mother's resilience seemed almost otherworldly. She worked long hours cleaning offices, her back bent and her hands raw, yet she still found time to sit with Alexander in the evenings. She would light a single candle when the electricity was cut off and read aloud from worn library books, her voice carrying worlds into their cramped living room. To Alexander, those moments were sacred, a reminder that despite everything, love could still exist within the ruins of disappointment. It was during one such evening that she told him the words that would echo through his life. Never ignore a child in need. Alexander, no matter how busy, no matter how tired, no matter how much the world hardens you, because once you were that child and someone chose not to see you. He did not fully understand at the time, but those words carved themselves into his memory, waiting like seeds beneath soil until they would one day sprout as adolescence approached. Alexander's hunger for something more only sharpened. He threw himself into studies, not from love of learning, but from the knowledge that education was his ladder out. He absorbed numbers, strategies, histories of men who had clawed their way to power from nothing. He admired not their wealth alone, but their ruthlessness, their refusal to be defined by the limits placed upon them. Somewhere deep inside, he vowed that he would never again be the boy waiting beneath a streetlight for someone to show up. He would be the man who never waited at all. The broken watch remained with him, hidden in a box at the back of his drawer. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, he would take it out and stare at its still hands. It became a mirror of his own past time, frozen at the moment of betrayal. He hated it, and yet he could not let it go. It was the last tangible piece of his father, and letting it slip from his hands felt like admitting the man would never return. Then came the day when the watch broke for good. He had been carrying it in his pocket when he tripped on the steps outside their apartment. It tumbled onto the pavement, face down. When he picked it up, the glass was cracked into spiderweb lines. The hands twisted uselessly. He pressed it against his chest, panic flooding him as though he had lost his father all over again. That evening, his mother found him clutching it in silence. She did not scold, did not tell him to be strong. She simply said, "Things break, Alexander. Sometimes they're meant to. What matters is what you carry inside you, not what you hold." In your hand, those words stayed with him. In time, the watch was gone, misplaced during one of the many moves that poverty forced upon them. But the absence was as sharp as its presence had once been. It haunted him like a phantom limb. Even when he achieved his first great success in business, signing deals worth more than his mother had earned in a lifetime of work, he felt that empty weight on his wrist, a reminder of what had been taken. It was this emptiness that fueled him. Each contract he won, each competitor he crushed, was not merely about profit. It was about proving that he was no longer that boy. He wore wealth like armor, power like a shield, convincing himself that if he built enough walls of influence, no one could ever abandon him again. He told himself that the past was buried, that the boy with the broken watch had been erased. But life has a way of circling back. On that rainy night years later, when Alexander saw Ben beneath the streetlight, his first instinct was the one he had trained himself to follow: distance. He had built a life on walking past need, on keeping emotion at bay. Yet the sight of the boy's trembling hand clutching a silver watch shattered that distance. For one terrifying moment, Alexander was not a powerful man in an expensive car. He was a child again, standing in the shadows, clutching his own broken watch, praying for someone to notice. The resemblance was uncanny. The watch Ben held was not identical to the one Alexander had lost, but close enough to make his chest ache. The same dull sheen, the same scratches that spoke of years of wear, the same fragile promise of permanence. It was as if time itself had delivered a mirror back to him, forcing him to confront what he had buried. He did not yet understand what it meant. He did not yet know that the boy's watch carried a story of betrayal and loss that would unravel into his own. But in that instant, Alexander felt the faint stirrings of recognition, the echo of his mother's voice. Never ignore a child in need. And for the first time in decades, he listened. By the time Alexander Grant reached adulthood, he had mastered the art of turning wounds into weapons. He no longer spoke of his father, nor of the broken watch, nor of the nights when he lay awake, listening to the sound of rain and wondering if anyone would come for him. Instead, he built himself into a man who never waited, who never hoped. Hope, he decided, was for children, and children were meant to be disappointed. Men created their own future, forged it with sheer will and unyielding resolve. He carried that philosophy into every step of his climb. At university, he was the student who rarely joined gatherings, who treated friendships as transactions and conversations as negotiations. He was brilliant, calculating, and some would say cold. Professors admired his discipline, but peers found him intimidating. While others wasted hours chasing fleeting pleasures, Alexander mapped out decades ahead. He read biographies of magnates who had risen from nothing, dissected their mistakes, and swore he would not repeat them. His armor grew thicker with each success, each accolade. But armor comes with a price. There were moments when Alexander's past threatened to surface, small, piercing moments that slipped past his defenses. A father and son walking hand in hand on a quiet street. A broken clock in a pawn shop window that looked too familiar. A child's voice crying out in a crowded station, only to be scooped up moments later by a reassuring parent. Each time, Alexander felt something stir inside him, a flicker of longing he crushed before it could grow. He told himself it was weakness. He told himself that the past was dead, that sentiment had no place in the empire he was building. Yet at night, when the world was silent and success no longer roared in his ears, the boy with the broken watch returned. He would close his eyes and see the spiderweb cracks across its face, feel the cold absence in his hand, and remember the silence of a father who never kept his word. His mother remained his only true tether to humanity. She never once asked for his wealth, never once leaned on him as he climbed higher. Instead, she reminded him, subtly gently, that kindness mattered more than contracts. On her final birthday before illness took her, she pressed his hand and said, "Alexander, don't let money harden you so much that you forget the sound of a child crying." He nodded at the time, offering her the polished assurance of a man who thought he had it under control. But those words burrowed deeper than he cared to admit. They followed him into boardrooms, into quiet hotel rooms at the top of glittering towers, into moments when the emptiness of his achievements pressed down like a weight he couldn't shake. For all his success, Alexander remained haunted. Haunted by absence, haunted by silence, haunted by the reminder that his life was built not on trust, but on the rubble of broken promises. He surrounded himself with people, yet few ever reached him. He spoke in precise tones, gave orders that were followed without hesitation, but intimacy was foreign to him. He had lovers, yes, but they were temporary, fleeting like the broken watch, destined to stop ticking. Still, he told himself he had won. He had outgrown the boy he once was. He had conquered the world on his own terms. Until that night in the rain. The moment he saw Ben beneath the streetlight, shivering, clutching a silver watch so eerily similar to his own, it was as though the decades between them collapsed. Alexander was no longer the formidable businessman stepping out of a sleek car. He was the abandoned boy again, waiting, clutching a broken piece of time. The sight cut through him with a force he hadn't felt in years. It was not pity, it was recognition. And in that recognition, the fortress he had spent a lifetime building began to crack. Ben's trembling hand, wrapped so tightly around the watch, was like a mirror thrust into Alexander's face. The boy's silence, the hollow look in his eyes, the way his lips shaped the words, "Please take me home, sir." All of it echoed Alexander's own childhood. The watch was not just a coincidence. It was a symbol, a reminder that the pain of abandonment does not vanish. It simply passes from one soul to another until someone chooses to break the cycle. For the first time in decades, Alexander remembered what his mother had told him: never ignore a child in need. And he realized how close he had come to doing just that, how easy it would have been to turn away, to retreat into his fortress of wealth and indifference. But he didn't, he couldn't, because ignoring Ben would have meant ignoring himself, the boy he had once been, the boy who had begged silently for someone to see him. In that moment, Alexander understood something he had never dared to admit. Success had not healed him. Money had not erased the emptiness. Power had not silenced the echoes of the past. He was still waiting, still carrying the absence of a father who never came back. But now, standing in the rain, he had the chance to become what he had needed all along. Not for himself, but for the boy clutching the watch. That realization shook him more than any financial risk, more than any hostile takeover or courtroom battle. It was not a contract or a deal, it was a choice. A choice to finally step out of the shadow of his past and into something larger than himself. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent a lifetime building walls to keep pain out, only to discover that his true salvation might lie in opening the gates. When he guided Ben into the car, when he heard the boy's small, ragged breaths in the silence, Alexander knew his life had shifted irreversibly. He did not yet know the full story behind the watch in Ben's hand, nor the conspiracy that would unravel in the weeks to come. But he knew this: the boy's presence was not an accident. It was a reckoning. And as the wipers cut arcs through the rain, Alexander's mind returned to the one object that had shaped his entire existence, the broken watch of his childhood. He remembered the feel of its cracked glass, the sting of betrayal it carried, the years of silence it symbolized. And then he looked at Ben, who clutched his own watch as though it were life itself. The hook of destiny was undeniable. Two boys separated by decades, both marked by time that had betrayed them. And now, fate had bound their stories together with the tick of a silver watch. Alexander whispered the thought to himself, not aloud, but deep inside where no one could hear. I thought I was saving him, but perhaps he is here to save me. That night, the fortress began to crumble. The drive back to Alexander Grant's home was unusually silent. The rain continued to lash against the windshield, drumming in rhythm with the beating of his heart. Beside him, Ben sat stiffly, his small fingers wrapped so tightly around the silver watch that his knuckles glowed white in the dim light. He hadn't spoken since he slid into the passenger seat, and Alexander hadn't pressed him. Questions swirled in his mind, but something told him to wait, to let the boy speak when he was ready. Alexander's home was a fortress of modern architecture, cold glass, sharp angles, the sort of place designed to impress rather than comfort. He hadn't brought anyone here in years, not even the few companions who flitted in and out of his personal life. As he pulled into the long driveway, he felt a strange unease. This house was meant for solitude, not sheltering a child. When they stepped inside, the contrast was stark. The polished marble floors reflected the glow of recessed lights. The air smelled faintly of leather and steel. Ben paused just beyond the threshold, his wet shoes leaving faint prints on the floor. His wide eyes darted around, as if unsure whether he belonged. "Upstairs," Alexander said, his voice steady though his chest tightened. "There are spare rooms. You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure something out." He almost added, "I'll take you somewhere," but the words caught in his throat. For now, the boy was here. That was enough. Ben followed. Silently, his small frame looking even smaller against the vast staircase. Alexander fetched a blanket from the linen closet, draping it over the boy once they reached the guest room. The bed was far too large for him, but Ben curled into the corner of it, watch still clutched to his chest. "You're safe here," Alexander said, almost surprised by the gentleness in his own tone. "Get some rest." But as he turned to leave, the boy's voice broke the silence. Soft, but sharp enough to stop him mid-step. "My father's in prison." Alexander froze. Slowly he turned back. Ben's eyes were fixed not on him, but on the watch in his hand. "He didn't do it," Ben continued, his words trembling, but determined. "They said he did, but he didn't. My stepmother Laura, she made it happen. She told me he's never coming home." His voice cracked on the last word, but he forced it out. "But I know he didn't do it." Alexander felt the weight of the words settle over him. Prison, stepmother, framed. It sounded like the desperate imaginings of a child clinging to hope. And yet, there was something in the boy's tone, an echo of truth, raw and unvarnished, that unsettled him. "Why do you believe he didn't do it?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice measured. Ben looked up at him then, eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because he promised me. My dad. He promised he'd never leave me. He said he'd always protect me. And he's not like her. He wouldn't lie. He wouldn't." His voice faltered, and he gripped the watch tighter. "This was his. He gave it to me before they took him away." The watch. Alexander's chest constricted. He remembered his own father's promises, empty words carried away by silence. He remembered clutching his broken watch, believing it meant something, only to learn that promises could shatter as easily as glass. But this boy clung to his father's promise with a conviction Alexander had once shared. It was like looking into a mirror, one that reflected not the man he had become, but the child he had been. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell Ben that the world didn't work the way children believed. That fathers left, that promises broke, that innocence was a fragile thing crushed by reality. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. Because in that moment, he realized that if he dismissed the boy's plea, he would be dismissing himself. "You said your stepmother, Lavra?" Alexander asked carefully. Ben nodded, his face twisting with a mixture of fear and anger. She smiles at everyone, but when no one's looking, she's different. She said she'd make sure my dad never came back. She said I belonged to her now, whether I wanted to or not. Alexander's jaw tightened. He had met enough people in his life to recognize the kind of cruelty that hid behind charm. He wanted to believe the boy's fears were exaggerated, born of grief. But deep down, he knew better. Children rarely invent monsters. They describe the ones they see too clearly. Still, Alexander struggled against the pull of belief. He had built his life on skepticism, on questioning motives, on trusting nothing without proof. Yet here was this child, clutching a silver watch, begging him to believe in something Alexander himself had stopped believing long ago, that a father's promise could be true. He sat at the edge of the bed, running a hand over his face. Ben, he said slowly, I don't know your father. I don't know your stepmother. But if what you're saying is true, then you're in danger. Ben's lip trembled, but he lifted his chin, stubborn and brave. I know. For a long time, neither spoke. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, the occasional patter against the window filling the silence. Alexander rose, his thoughts in turmoil. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He had intended for this to be temporary. One night. Shelter, then a phone call to the authorities, perhaps. That was what reason demanded. But reason was at war with memory. His mother's voice, soft but resolute, echoed in his mind. Never ignore a child in need. Alexander poured himself a glass of whiskey in the study, staring into the amber liquid as if it held answers. He tried to convince himself that the boy's story was not his burden to carry, that he had built an empire precisely to avoid being ensnared by the chaos of others. But the truth pressed in on him like the walls of the room. He couldn't turn away, not this time. And then, just as he was beginning to think he might be losing his grip on reason, a sound outside shattered any illusion of choice. A car door slamming, muffled voices, the crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. Alexander moved to the window, drawing the curtain back slightly. Two men stood at the edge of his driveway, their figures blurred by the mist, but their movements deliberate. One of them spoke into a phone, his voice carrying faintly through the rain. We'll find him. Lavra wants the boy back tonight. The glass of whiskey shook in Alexander's hand. He set it down carefully, his pulse thundering in his ears. Ben's story was no fantasy. The danger was real. And it was already at his doorstep. The sight of the two men on his driveway ignited something deep in Alexander, a sharp, familiar instinct that had kept him alive in the cutthroat world of business. Danger. It was written in their posture, in the way they scanned the property, in the deliberate way they stood apart as if staking a perimeter. These weren't good Samaritans searching for a lost child. These were hunters. Alexander let the curtain fall back into place. His heart was pounding, but his face remained calm, controlled. Decades of boardroom battles had taught him how to hide panic behind a mask of steel, and he wore it now, though the stakes were higher than any hostile takeover. He moved silently through the hallway, his footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. His first thought was to secure Ben. He pushed open the guest room door just enough to peer inside. The boy had drifted into an uneasy sleep, still curled around. The silver watch, his small chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. For a moment, Alexander stood there, struck by the sight. A child asleep in his house, something he had never imagined. Something he had never wanted, but the world outside was closing in. He stepped into the room and gently shook Ben's shoulder. The boy stirred, blinking in confusion. Ben, Alexander whispered, his tone sharper than he intended. Wake up. The boy sat up, fear flickering instantly in his eyes. What is it? Quiet, Alexander said. He crouched down so their eyes were level. There are men outside. They're looking for you. Ben's face went pale. His grip on the watch tightened until his hand trembled. She sent them. Alexander didn't ask who she was. He already knew. Yes, he said. Now listen to me. You're safe in here, but you must do exactly as I tell you. No noise, no movement until I say. Ben nodded, his small body rigid with fear. Alexander crossed the room and opened the closet. It was deep, lined with coats he rarely wore. He motioned for Ben to climb inside. The boy obeyed without question, curling into the shadows. Alexander pulled the door almost shut, leaving just enough of a gap for air. He crouched again and met Ben's terrified gaze through the sliver of light. "Whatever happens, stay quiet," he said. "Do you understand?" Ben's nod was barely visible, but it was enough. Alexander closed the door, his jaw tightening. Then he straightened, smoothed his jacket, and walked back into the hallway. He needed time to think. The front of the house was dominated by tall glass panes, a design choice he had once praised for its grandeur, but now cursed it for its vulnerability. He stepped into the foyer, listening. The voices were clearer, now two men arguing quietly, their words fractured by the rain. "Can't just stand here all night. If the kid came this way, we'll see the lights. Lavra said he can't disappear. If he's with anyone, we bring him back." The confirmation was like a blade pressing against Alexander's ribs. Not only had Ben spoken the truth, but Laura was already tightening her grip. Alexander considered his options. He could call the police, but experience told him that influence could reach even official channels. He didn't know how deep Laura's power ran, but if she had arranged for David Miller to be imprisoned, she was capable of manipulating far more. And once the boy's presence was reported, there was no guarantee he would be safe. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the weight of indecision. He was a man accustomed to certainty, to decisive action. Yet now he was torn between disbelief and a haunting recognition. The echo of his own childhood abandonment pressed against him, demanding he act. He retreated to the study, closing the door quietly. The men outside hadn't approached further, but he knew they would not wait forever. He sat at his desk, staring at the sleek phone resting on its surface. He could end this now, make one call, and the boy would be out of his house, his life untouched. But as he reached for it, his hand froze. He remembered a night long ago when he had hidden beneath his own blanket, clutching his broken watch, praying that anyone would choose to stay. No one had. Now fate had delivered him the same moment, inverted. This time, he was the one being asked. A knock startled him, not at the front door, but at the study door. His pulse surged. But when he opened it, Ben stood there, pale but defiant. "I couldn't stay in the closet," Ben whispered. "I don't like the dark." His lip trembled, but he held himself steady. "What are we going to do?" Alexander looked at him, and for once, he didn't see weakness and fear. He saw courage, the courage it took for a child to stand up against shadows larger than himself. He closed the door gently and crouched before the boy. "We're going to keep you safe. But you have to trust me." "I do," Ben said. He looked down at the watch in his hand. "Because my dad said someone would believe me. He said the truth always finds a way." The words pierced Alexander. They were too much like his mother's, different in form, but the same in spirit. Never ignore a child in need. The truth will always find a way. He felt as though the ghosts of his past were all converging in this single moment, urging him toward a choice he had avoided all his life. Outside, the voices grew louder, closer. Alexander crossed to the window again and saw the men moving toward the house. Time was running out. He turned back to Ben. "Go back to the guest room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Ben nodded, his small jaw clenched with determination. He hurried down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. Alexander remained by the window, watching as the two figures advanced, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in decades, he was not fighting for a contract or a fortune. He was fighting for something raw, something human. And though he had no plan, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would not let them take the boy. The sound of footsteps crunching closer along the gravel cut through the night like a warning bell. Alexander pulled the curtain just far enough to watch the two men approach. They weren't cautious anymore. They moved with the bold confidence of men who believed they had the upper hand. One tapped a flashlight against his palm, the beam flicking across the rain-slicked driveway, while the other adjusted the collar of his coat and scanned the windows with sharp eyes. Alexander's house had been designed to intimidate, to keep others at a distance. Now, its openness worked against him. Too many windows, too many lines of sight. He could almost feel their gazes crawling over the walls, searching for weakness. He took a breath, steadying himself. Panic was useless. This wasn't the boardroom, but the same rules applied. Whoever showed fear first, lost. The intercom at the gate buzzed, a low, insistent sound. The men were no longer pretending to be passers-by. They wanted entry. "Mr. Grant," one of the voices called out, distorted by the speaker but unmistakably firm. "We're looking for someone. A boy. He's wandered off. It's dangerous weather for a child to be alone. We just need to check if he's here." Alexander almost laughed at the audacity. A boy who wandered off. Their lie was as thin as tissue. He didn't answer. Instead, he let the silence hang, long enough to make them uneasy. The buzzer sounded again, louder, sharper. "We don't want trouble. Open the gate, and we'll be on our way." Alexander's jaw clenched. Trouble was exactly what they wanted. He turned from the window and strode down the hall toward the guest room. Inside, Ben sat upright on the bed, the blanket pooled around his waist, eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't ask what was happening. He already knew. The boy was too used to danger, too practiced at reading the tension in adults' voices. "They're here, aren't they?" Ben whispered. "Yes," Alexander admitted. "But you're safe as long as you stay inside. Lock the door. Don't open it until I say." Ben's small hands trembled around the watch. "If they take me back to her," his voice cracked, "she'll make sure I never see my dad again." Alexander crouched beside him, his voice steady but fierce. "That won't happen. Not while you're under my roof." The words came out before he realized he'd spoken them. A vow, the kind he had long ago sworn he would never make, because promises had a way of breaking. But looking into Ben's desperate eyes, he understood. There was no alternative. The boy needed someone to stand between him and the storm. He left the room and closed the door firmly behind him. As he walked back toward the foyer, memories surged, his father's broken promises, his mother's whispered words about never ignoring a child in need. He felt the weight of those ghosts pressing him forward. This was no longer about logic or responsibility. This was about redemption. The intercom buzzed again, sharper this time, followed by the harsh metallic rattle of the gate. The men were testing it. Alexander's house was secure, but no wall was impenetrable. He needed to act before they decided to force their way in. He stepped into the study, switched on the desk lamp, and picked up the phone. His finger hovered over the keypad. He could call the police, report intruders, demand protection. But doubt gnawed at him. If Lavra had orchestrated David Miller's imprisonment, her reach might extend into law enforcement. A call to the police might hand Ben directly into her grasp. For once, Alexander Grant, the man who prided himself on seeing through every deception, every hidden clause, felt uncertain. He slammed the phone back onto the receiver and pressed his palms against the desk. The men outside were growing impatient. Their muffled conversation drifted through the glass. "He's here. I can feel it. The boss said to search every house on this street if we had to. Grant won't give him up easily. He's not the type. Then we make him." Alexander's chest tightened. The confirmation was clear. This wasn't random. They knew who he was. They had chosen his house deliberately, which meant Laura's men were prepared for confrontation. He moved swiftly back to the hallway and checked the locks on the doors. Every click echoed in the silence. Upstairs, the faint creak of floorboards told him Ben was awake, listening to every sound. The storm outside had weakened to a steady drizzle, but inside the house, tension thickened with every passing second. Alexander felt the strange, unnerving sensation of time looping back. Years ago, he had been the helpless child clutching a broken watch, waiting for someone to protect him. Now he was the one standing guard while a child upstairs prayed for safety. And then came the breaking point. A heavy thud at the gate. Another, metal straining under force. The men were no longer pretending. Alexander straightened, every nerve alive. He was not a fighter by trade, but he was not defenseless either. Years of survival in the ruthless world of power had honed a kind of instinct, not for fists or weapons, but for strategy, and strategy would have to be enough. The intercom crackled one last time. "Mr. Grant, open the gate. We know the boy is there. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The voice was colder now, stripped of its earlier pretense. Alexander's pulse hammered, but his resolve hardened. He glanced once more toward the stairs, toward the boy waiting in silence above. This wasn't temporary anymore. Fate had delivered him a choice, and he had made it. He would not hand Ben over. He would not repeat the mistakes of his father. He would not walk away. The thunder of fists on the gate grew louder, and then silence. Too sudden, too deliberate. Alexander stepped to the window, drawing the curtain just enough to peer outside. The men were gone from view. The gate stood, still glistening with rain. For a moment, he wondered if they had left, but deep down, he knew better. Predators didn't give up that easily. The silence was worse than the pounding. It meant they were already planning their next move. Alexander let the curtain fall back into place. He turned toward the staircase, his expression grim, his mind racing. The boy's story was real. The danger was real. And the storm outside had just become a war inside his own life. The morning after the storm felt deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the glass walls of Alexander's home, casting long streaks of gold across the marble floor. To an outsider, it was an ordinary day. But for Alexander, the weight of the night before lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. Ben was still upstairs, asleep at last after hours of restless tossing, his small frame curled tight against the blanket. Alexander sat in his study, staring at the faint condensation on his untouched coffee. He wasn't a man accustomed to hesitation. Every major decision in his career had been made with speed and precision. But this was different. This wasn't about numbers or contracts. It was about lives, about the truth of a boy who had been hunted like prey. He could no longer dismiss Ben's words as the desperate ramblings of a child. The men at his gate had confirmed everything. Lavra was no ordinary stepmother. She was ruthless, dangerous, and powerful enough to send men prowling through the night without fear of consequence. And if she could put David Miller behind bars, framed for crimes he didn't commit, then Alexander knew this was not a battle he could fight alone. That morning, he made 2 calls. The first was to Ethan Carter, a lawyer whose reputation had survived in a city where reputations rarely lasted. Ethan was known not for his wealth or flash, but for his integrity, a rarity in the circles Alexander moved in. He was principled to the point of stubbornness, the kind of man who would walk away from lucrative cases if they compromised his values. For Alexander, who trusted almost no one, Ethan's name was the only one he could bring himself to dial. The second call was to Naomi Price, a private investigator with a mind like a scalpel. She had made her career uncovering what others worked desperately to keep buried. Ruthless in her pursuit of truth, She had exposed corporate frauds, political scandals, and police corruption. Alexander had hired her once before, years ago, when a rival tried to undercut his company with falsified reports. She had uncovered the truth in weeks, and though he hadn't needed her services since, her name had stayed with him. By noon, both Ethan and Naomi were seated in his study. Ben lingered by the door, too shy to approach but unwilling to leave. Alexander sighed. "This is not a typical case," Alexander began, his voice measured. "David Miller, wrongfully imprisoned, according to his son. His wife Laura Miller engineered the charges. I need to know if there's truth in it. And if there is, I need it dismantled." Ethan leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. His expression was calm but thoughtful. Framing a man for a crime he didn't commit isn't just unusual, it's deliberate. If Lavra has the influence you're suggesting, then it won't just be about finding evidence. It'll be about surviving the backlash once we do. Naomi, who had been jotting notes in a small leather-bound book, looked up with sharp eyes. "What exactly are we dealing with? Fraud? Violence? Money laundering?" "According to Ben," Alexander said, "Lavra told him that David would never come home, that she made sure of it. She's spreading lies painting him as violent, corrupt. But the boy is adamant. He swears his father is innocent." Naomi's brow furrowed. "Children don't usually invent details like that. If he believes his father was framed, there's a reason." Ethan turned his gaze to Alexander. "Why you? Why take this on? You've built your life avoiding battles that don't serve your interests. Why now?" The question hit deeper than Alexander expected. He could have offered a calculated response, that he disliked injustice, that protecting Ben aligned with his reputation, that Laura's reach posed a threat to his own stability. But the truth was harder to admit, even to himself. "Because I know what it is to be abandoned," he said finally, his voice lower. "And I know what it is to clutch something broken, believing it still means your father's promise is real." His eyes flicked to Ben, who looked up at him with silent trust. This boy deserves better than silence. The room was quiet after that. Ethan's expression softened, and Naomi gave a small nod. The battle had already begun, and both of them knew it. Over the following days, the struggle revealed itself in layers. Laura's influence ran deeper than Alexander had anticipated. News articles began surfacing subtle at first, then more deliberate, painting David Miller as a violent man who had terrorized his family and defrauded investors. Editorials described him as a wolf in sheep's clothing, while anonymous. Sources whispered about bribes and hidden accounts. The stories were all consistent, all carefully seeded. But Alexander had weathered campaigns of misinformation before, and he recognized the signs. This wasn't truth bubbling to the surface. This was a machine at work, fueled by money and connections, designed to bury David's name beneath dirt. Until no one questioned his guilt. Naomi worked in silence, her investigations threading through the city like invisible wires. She spent her days combing through records, her nights trailing figures connected to Lavra. Each evening she returned with fragments, strange financial transfers, hushed conversations overheard at upscale restaurants, whispers of deals cut in back rooms. It wasn't enough to expose Lavra, but it was enough to prove a pattern. Ethan, meanwhile, waged his war in the courtroom corridors. He filed appeals, requested records, pressed judges who had long since closed their ears to David's case. Each step was met with resistance. Doors closed. Files were sealed. Witnesses refused to speak. The more Ethan pushed, the more Alexander realized the depth of Laura's reach. Through it all, Ben remained by Alexander's side. At first, the boy was quiet, watching him from a distance, as if afraid the man might vanish the way his father had. But slowly, the walls between them began to soften. Alexander, who had once scoffed at the idea of family, found himself adjusting his schedule to sit with the boy during meals, listening as Ben spoke of small things, his favorite books, the Games he used to play with his father, the way Lavra would smile in public and turn cold in private. One evening, as Ben drifted asleep on the couch, Alexander noticed the boy's hand slip from the watch at last, his grip loosening in unconscious trust. The sight unsettled him, because for the first time in decades, Alexander felt like someone's protector. Not out of duty, not out of strategy, but out of something far older. Yet alongside this fragile bond grew an inner war. Alexander asked himself questions he could not answer. Was he fighting for justice for David Miller, for Ben Orr? Was he fighting for himself? Was this about redemption, about finally giving the child he once was the protector he had needed? And if so, was he doing this for the right reasons, or simply to heal his own wounds? The questions haunted him, but each time he looked at Ben, he knew he couldn't walk away. And just as he began to settle into the rhythm of their struggle, the threats began. First it was surveillance, a black car parked too long outside his gates, shadows lingering at the edges of his property. Then came the calls. Anonymous voices warning him to step aside, to stop meddling in affairs that didn't concern him. Finally, an envelope arrived at his office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words scrawled in red ink. Everyone has a price. Alexander burned the note in his fireplace. But deep down, he knew the war had only just begun. The threats only sharpened Alexander's resolve. In his world, intimidation was a familiar tactic. Competitors had tried to rattle him before anonymous leaks, smear campaigns, hostile board votes. He had crushed them all. But this was different. This wasn't about profits or reputation. This was about a boy's future, a father's freedom, and a truth buried beneath layers of corruption. Ethan Carter warned him that the legal fight would not be swift. Laura's lawyers know how to stall, he explained one afternoon as he spread documents across Alexander's desk. They'll bury us in paperwork, request endless continuances, push this case until it dies of exhaustion. If David's conviction is tied to sealed evidence, we'll need extraordinary grounds to unearth it. Alexander leaned over the papers, scanning every line with sharp eyes. Then we'll give them extraordinary grounds. Ethan studied him for a moment. You know this will get ugly. Alexander's mouth hardened into a grim line. It already is. Meanwhile, Naomi worked the shadows with her usual relentlessness. She followed money trails that slithered through shell companies, traced Laura's connections to high-end developers and councilmen, pieced together hints of something larger than a family dispute. One evening, she returned with a small USB drive and tossed it onto Alexander's desk. "Bank records," she said, her tone clipped. "Unusual withdrawals, offshore accounts. Someone's been siphoning money for years. It doesn't prove who signed the papers, but the timing aligns with David's arrest. He goes to prison, and suddenly Laura's account starts swelling." Alexander studied the files, the numbers leaping off the screen. She needed him gone, Naomi nodded. And she made sure of it. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered. Witnesses who had once spoken freely about Laura's lavish spending suddenly refused to answer calls. Journalists who had shown interest in the story backed away without explanation. One even admitted, in a hushed voice, that running anything against Lavra was career suicide. Through it all, Ben clung to Alexander as though he were an anchor. He shadowed him around the house, asking questions about his work, about the case, about whether his father would really come home. At first, Alexander answered curtly, unwilling to expose the boy to false hope. But one evening, when Ben looked at him and whispered, "You won't let her win, will you?" Something inside Alexander shifted. "No," he said simply. "I won't." The boy's small smile in that moment struck him harder than any business triumph. It wasn't victory, it was trust. And it terrified him. For every small step forward, Lavra struck back harder. One night, Alexander's car alarm blared in the driveway, but when he checked the security cameras, the feed had been wiped. Another evening, a man approached him outside his office and offered him a thin envelope of cash with a single message: "Walk away." Alexander didn't even open it. He shoved it back into the man's chest and said, "Tell her she can't afford me." Still, doubt gnawed at him in quiet hours. Was he fighting for Ben's father or for himself? Each time he looked at the boy's watch, so much like his own broken one, he felt the weight of memory pressing down. He told himself he was doing this for justice, but he couldn't deny the echo of his own abandoned childhood driving his every step. He wanted redemption, not just for David Miller, but for the boy Alexander had once been, clutching a broken watch and waiting for someone who never came. The tension reached a breaking point 2 weeks into the investigation. Naomi had been working late nights, combing through sealed court documents that Ethan couldn't access through official channels. She had connections in places few dared to admit existed, and her persistence finally paid off. It was near midnight when she stormed into Alexander's study, her coat dripping with rain, her eyes blazing with the satisfaction of a hunter closing in on prey. She dropped a thick folder onto his desk, the sound cracking through the silence. "These were supposed to stay buried," she said, "but I found them." Alexander opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of sealed documents, financial ledgers, court transcripts, internal memos from David's company. He scanned the pages, his sharp eyes narrowing as the pieces aligned. Lavra hadn't just framed David out of malice or personal vendetta. She had framed him to cover her own crimes. The documents detailed an elaborate embezzlement scheme, money siphoned from company accounts, laundered through false vendors, hidden offshore. When auditors had begun circling too close, Lavra had turned the spotlight onto David, planting evidence of fraud and violence that shifted blame entirely onto him. "She buried him to save herself," Alexander muttered, his voice low with fury. Naomi leaned forward. "And she did it well. These files show how deep her reach goes. Judges, accountants, even law enforcement, all touched by her money. But here's the crack in her wall. These ledgers don't match the official trial records. They were doctored." "That's your opening." Alexander's hand tightened on the folder until his knuckles whitened. He thought of Ben, asleep upstairs, clutching the watch his father had given him. He thought of his own childhood, the silence of abandonment, the sting of betrayal. And for the first time since the fight began, he saw not just a battle, but a war he could win. Ethan arrived the next morning, his calm demeanor breaking into something sharper when he reviewed the documents. "If we can authenticate these, it's enough to reopen the case. But Lavra won't go down without a fight. Once she realizes we've uncovered this, she'll unleash everything she has." Alexander closed the folder with deliberate care. "Then let her. She spent years burying the truth. Now we'll dig it up, piece by piece, until she has nowhere left to hide." The battle lines were drawn. What began as a temporary shelter for a frightened boy had become something larger, something unstoppable. Alexander knew the cost would be high, but the choice was no longer his to make. He had already chosen the moment he pulled Ben out of the rain. And as Naomi's words echoed in his mind, "These were supposed to stay buried, but I found them," he knew the fight for David Miller's freedom was no longer just about justice. It was about exposing Laura's empire of lies. It was about proving that some promises, like a father's to his son, were worth fighting for, even when the world conspired to break them. And for Alexander, it was about redemption at last. Naomi spread the documents across Alexander's desk like the pieces of a puzzle no one had wanted to solve. Pages of court transcripts, bank slips, witness depositions, each carrying the fingerprints of Laura's corruption. The deeper they sifted, the clearer the picture became. David Miller's conviction had not been an accident of circumstance. It had been engineered. "Look at this," Naomi said, her sharp eyes flashing. She slid a transcript across to Alexander and Ethan. Testimony from one of David's former employees. He claimed David threatened him with violence unless he falsified company accounts. Ethan scanned the page, his brow furrowed. I remember this from the trial summary. That testimony was the backbone of the prosecution. Naomi leaned closer, tapping a line with her pen. What the records don't show is that this witness bought a new house 3 months later. Paid in full, no mortgage, no loans. Just a fat envelope of cash, courtesy of Laura's shell companies. Alexander's jaw tightened. She bought his fear, and then she bought his voice. Naomi nodded. And she didn't stop there. Judges received campaign donations through 30 groups. Prosecutors had debts wiped clean. And even the prison warden received a sudden consulting fee from a firm tied to Laura's empire. She didn't just tilt the scales of justice, she broke them. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. If half of this is authenticated, it's explosive. But courts don't like being told they were duped. They'll resist reopening a case unless the evidence is airtight. Alexander's eyes were cold, focused. Then we'll make it airtight. The discovery fueled their long nights. Naomi traced every transfer. Ethan drafted motions. And Alexander funded the work with the kind of resources only a man of his wealth could provide. Yet even as they pieced together Laura's manipulations, doubts surfaced from unexpected corners. Rumors began circulating in small towns where David had once conducted business. Old acquaintances whispered conflicting stories. Some swore he had been a good man, devoted to his son, betrayed by those closest to him. Others muttered that he had a temper, that he cut corners, that perhaps Laura hadn't lied after all. Naomi returned from one of her trips to the countryside with conflicting reports. Villagers remember him as generous, always helping with small loans, supporting local causes. But business rivals tell another story. They claim he was ruthless, quick to anger, willing to bend rules if it suited him. Ethan frowned. That muddies things. If the jury had heard that kind of division, it would have tilted perception. People don't need proof to doubt, they just need noise. Alexander listened, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He knew too well how unreliable narration could poison truth. In his own life, he had seen reputations destroyed not by facts but by whispers. Still, the question burrowed into him. What if Ben's certainty wasn't the whole story? What if David had shadows of his own? That night, as Ben sat at the kitchen table tracing his finger along the edge of the silver watch, Alexander asked softly, "Tell me again, when did your father give this to you?" Ben looked up, his eyes wide, as if startled that Alexander might doubt him. The day they came to take him away. He put it in my hand and said, "Keep this. It'll remind you I'm coming back." The boy's voice trembled, but his grip on the watch was firm. He wouldn't lie. Not to me. Alexander reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently over Ben's. The metal of the watch was cool, almost eerily familiar. His own father's broken watch had been a symbol of betrayal, of promises shattered. But this one pulsed with a different weight. A promise still alive, waiting to be redeemed. The doubts gnawed at Alexander, but he couldn't voice them. Not to the boy. Instead, he carried them silently, knowing that truth is often a shifting thing, elusive, twisted by perspective. It was Clara who finally shifted the tide. She arrived one afternoon at Ethan's office, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a voice that trembled between courage and fear. She had been a family friend of the Millers for decades, she explained, but had stayed silent during the trial out of fear of Laura's reach. Now hearing whispers that someone was fighting for David again, she could no longer hold her tongue. David wasn't perfect, Clara admitted, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He worked too hard, pushed himself, sometimes let stress make him short-tempered. But violent? Corrupt? Never. He loved his son more than anything. He'd bring Ben to our house every Sunday for dinner after his wife passed. He'd sit with him, teach him chess, read him bedtime stories even when he was bone-tired from work. That man wasn't guilty of what they said. He was guilty of trusting the wrong people. Naomi leaned forward. "You mean Lavra?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. Yes, she came into their lives like a savior, charming, sophisticated. David thought she was his second chance at happiness. But she wanted his company, his money, his influence. When he started questioning the accounts, when he realized funds were disappearing, she turned on him. She set him up, and she made sure Ben was too young to understand what was happening. Her words struck Alexander like a hammer. Betrayed. By those closest to him, the pattern was painfully familiar. It was the kind of betrayal that left scars too deep to measure. Later that evening, when Clara left, Ethan spoke gravely. "Her testimony could help, but it's still word against." "Word. We need something concrete." Naomi, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally said, "I think I've found something. Lavra isn't just protecting her wealth, she's securing her future. I intercepted a file from a prison transfer board. It's marked confidential, not meant for public eyes." She slid a document across the table. Alexander picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he read. David Miller was scheduled for a quiet transfer. No public announcement, no press. He was being moved to a higher security facility upstate. The kind of place where inmates disappeared into routine and rarely emerged again. Ethan's voice was grim. "If he's transferred there, it's over. He'll be buried alive in bureaucracy. Even if we clear his name, dragging him out will be 10 times harder." Alexander's hand tightened on the paper. He felt the familiar surge of fury rising, the same fury that had driven him as a boy. When promises shattered, the same fury that had built his empire brick by brick. But now it wasn't about money or pride. It was about a boy upstairs, waiting for his father's return, clutching a watch as though it were life itself. Lavra wasn't just trying to silence David. She was trying to erase him. And Alexander knew with chilling certainty that if they didn't act now, she would succeed. The discovery of the transfer order cast a new urgency over everything. Alexander sat in silence for a long moment, the papers heavy in his hands, his thoughts moving with razor clarity. Laura's move was calculated, clinical. By shifting David to a higher security prison, she was tightening the noose, ensuring that even if Ethan and Naomi managed to scrape together enough evidence, dragging him back into court would be nearly impossible. It was the kind of maneuver only someone with both influence and cruelty could execute. Naomi paced the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She's not just protecting her embezzlement. She's eliminating any chance of him speaking, of testifying against her. Once he's in there, he may as well be dead. Ethan's expression was equally grim. "We need to file an injunction immediately. If we can prove the transfer is tied to irregular motives, we can stall it long enough to present our evidence." Alexander didn't respond right away. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the city stretched out in cold silence. He thought of Ben upstairs, likely asleep with the watch pressed against his chest. That boy had clung to him with a kind of faith Alexander had long thought extinct. And now, fate was demanding he decide if that faith was worth the war he was about to wage. He finally set the papers down with deliberate care. "We stop her, whatever it takes." Naomi nodded, but her eyes were troubled. "You need to understand something, Alexander. Lavra won't hesitate to hit back harder. You've already seen her send men to your doorstep. If we move against this transfer, she unleash everything she has." Alexander's mouth curved into a hard line, then let her. "I've fought worse storms." Yet even as he spoke, doubts swirled like ghosts. The whispers Naomi had uncovered in the villages lingered, conflicting stories about David's temper, his supposed ruthlessness. What if Ben's father wasn't the man the boy believed him to be? What if Alexander was fighting for a ghost of innocence that didn't exist? That night, Sleep eluded him. He paced the darkened halls of his home, the sound of the rain tapping against the glass like a relentless reminder. Memories returned unbidden. His own childhood, the broken watch he had once held so tightly, the promises that had crumbled into silence. He remembered his mother's voice telling him never to ignore a child in need. And he remembered the fear of abandonment that had shaped him into the man he had become. He stopped outside Ben's room. The boy was asleep, curled on his side, the silver watch clutched in his hand. In the faint glow of the nightlight, his small face looked peaceful but fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter him. Alexander stepped inside quietly, standing at the edge of the bed. He studied the watch again, its worn face glinting faintly. That simple object had become the axis of everything past, present, future. His own broken watch had symbolized betrayal. Ben's watch symbolized hope. Two lives connected by timepieces, both waiting for promises that seemed impossible. He reached out, gently adjusting the blanket over Ben's shoulder. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake. And in that moment, Alexander felt the truth settle deep inside him. This wasn't just about David anymore. This was about breaking a cycle. About proving, if only to one child, that promises could still be kept. The next morning, Clara returned with more fragments of memory, her voice trembling as she recounted nights when David had confided his suspicions to her. He said the numbers weren't adding up. He told me he feared Lovra was moving money. But he didn't know how deep it went. He was going to confront her the week before he was arrested. He never got the chance. Her testimony painted a picture that even Alexander couldn't ignore. David had been silenced, precisely because he had begun to uncover the truth. Ethan folded his arms, his expression tightening. If Lovra orchestrated this, then David isn't just a victim. He's the last loose thread in her scheme. And she's determined to cut it. Naomi laid a new file on the desk. I traced the sealed documents further. They connect directly to Laura's private accounts. Shell companies, false invoices, even donations to charities that don't exist. But here's the key. Some of the same officials who testified against David show up in those transactions. Bribes, clear as day. If we expose this, it doesn't just unravel David's conviction. It implicates half the people who helped her build her empire. Alexander felt the weight of the revelation. This wasn't just about freeing one man. It was about toppling an entire network of corruption. But the victory felt fragile, because Laura was still 2 steps ahead. That evening, Naomi received a message from one of her contacts inside the prison system. She read it twice, her face paling, before passing the phone to Alexander. The message was short, but devastating. Transfer scheduled within 72 hours. Destination undisclosed. Once moved, he's gone. The room fell into heavy silence. Ethan broke it first. If she pulls this off, everything we've uncovered may be meaningless. He'll vanish into the system, buried under layers of red tape. Even if we prove his innocence, she'd drag appeals for years until he rots in there. Alexander's hand clenched into a fist. He could see the trap clearly now. Lavra didn't just want to destroy David's freedom. She wanted to destroy hope itself. He rose from his chair, his voice low but steady. Then we don't wait. We strike first. We take what Naomi's found, and we expose it before she makes her move. Naomi shook her head. Not yet. The documents aren't airtight. If we go public too soon, she'll spin it as a smear campaign and bury us under countersuits. We need one more piece of proof, something undeniable. Alexander's gaze darkened. Then find it, whatever it takes. The air in the room was electric with urgency, each of them feeling the weight of what lay ahead. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were racing against time. That night, Alexander stood once more at his window, staring out into the darkness. The city lights shimmered faintly, but his thoughts were fixed on the prison. Walls miles away, where David Miller sat unaware of the storm building outside. He whispered to himself, not as a businessman, not as a strategist, but as a man haunted by his own past. I won't let her erase him, not like my father erased me. And in the silence that followed, the path forward was clear. Laura's plan was in motion. The transfer was imminent. The fight to save David Miller and to protect the boy who believed in him was no longer a matter of justice. It was a matter of survival. The courtroom buzzed with tension, its wooden benches filled with reporters, rivals, and curious onlookers who had come to witness the storm. At the front sat Laura Miller, immaculate in a tailored suit, her smile thin, her eyes venomous. To her left, Ethan Carter adjusted his papers, calm but coiled. Alexander stood beside him, not as a businessman but as a man ready for war. When the judge called the court to order, Ethan rose first. His voice was measured, deliberate, every word sharpened by weeks of preparation. He laid out the evidence piece by piece. The doctored ledgers Naomi had unearthed, the bribery transfers disguised as charitable donations, the sudden house purchases and erased debts of witnesses who had once sworn against David Miller. Each revelation was a blow, and though Laura's smile never faltered, her hand twitched against the table. Then Ethan called Clara to the stand. Her testimony was quiet but devastating. She spoke of Sunday dinners, of David reading bedtime stories to Ben, of the moment he confided in her about Laura's theft and his fear of what she might do. The courtroom leaned forward, the whispers rising until the judge demanded silence. Laura struck back with venom. When it was her turn, she rose gracefully, her voice dripping with false sincerity. She painted herself as a devoted stepmother, a woman betrayed by a violent husband and now targeted by a greedy millionaire. Then she turned her gaze on Alexander. "You think this is about justice?" She spat. "This is about power. This man has exploited a grieving boy, turned him into a pawn to settle his own grudges. Alexander Grant doesn't care about David Miller. He cares about redemption for his own failures. And you all are too blind to see it." The sting of her words cut deep, but Alexander didn't flinch. He had lived too long in the shadow of falsehoods to be shaken by them now. Ethan rose again. "We call Benjamin Miller to the stand." The room stilled. Ben walked forward, his small figure dwarfed by the vast courtroom. He clutched the silver watch in both hands, his steps hesitant but resolute. When he sat, his voice trembled at first, barely audible. "My dad, he never hurt anyone. He was kind. He always read me stories, even when he was tired. He told me this watch would remind me he was coming back." He lifted it slightly, the chain glinting in the light. His eyes filled with tears, but he forced the words out. And I never stopped believing him. For a long, heavy moment, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed caught in the stillness of a boy's unwavering faith. That was when Alexander rose. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. In his hand, he held the silver watch. The same timepiece that had haunted him since the night in the rain. The one that tied father to son, past to present. "This," Alexander said, his voice echoing in the chamber, "is not just a watch. It is proof of a promise, a promise." Laura Miller tried to erase. She thought she could bury truth with bribes and lies. But time has a way of revealing what we try hardest to hide. And with a final resounding gesture, he slammed the watch onto the table. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gavel of destiny. The verdict came swift: guilty, fraud, embezzlement, perjury. Laura's mask finally shattered as she was led away, her composure gone, venom dissolving into rage. Then came the moment that silenced even the reporters' pens. David Miller entered, shackles removed, his face gaunt but eyes alive with the weight of freedom. Ben broke from his seat, running across the room. When he threw himself into his father's arms, his words pierced through the air. I knew you'd come home." The boy's whisper, filled with triumph and relief, brought tears to faces hardened by years of cynicism. Father and son clung to each other, the silver watch pressed between them, no longer a symbol of loss, but of faith fulfilled. Alexander stood apart, his chest tight. For years he had built walls of wealth to shield himself from pain. But as he watched Ben's arms wrapped around his father, he felt the walls crumble. A tear slid down his cheek before he could stop it. For the first time in decades, he realized he was not alone. He had not just fought for justice. He had found the family he never thought possible. And in the echo of the watch's final slam, Alexander Grant understood what redemption truly meant. Weeks passed, and the storm that had nearly consumed them all began to settle. David Miller walked free, his shoulders no longer bowed by chains, but lifted by the sight of his son at his side. Each day he rebuilt, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet constancy of a father finally restored, making breakfast, helping with schoolwork, listening when Ben spoke. For the boy, every moment was proof that faith had not been wasted. Alexander remained close, not hovering, but present in ways he had never been for anyone. He found himself at their table more often than in his office, answering Ben's endless questions, sharing lessons, listening to laughter that felt strange and healing in his ears. For years, wealth had been his shield, but it had never touched the hollow ache of abandonment. Compassion had done what fortune could not. It had stitched together the wound of a broken childhood. One afternoon, as he walked with Ben down a sunlit street, the silver watch glinted on the boy's wrist, ticking steady at last. Alexander paused, hearing in its rhythm more than time. Sometimes, he thought, a broken clock still beats. And in that sound, he felt whole.